MidnightMaker.com.
Shh. Sorry, babe.
Mancraft 101, building CLC's Passagemaker Dinghy. This build is sponsored by Moss Epoxy's time-saving epoxy resin. Check out mossepoxies.com. Part 1, making your own kit. If you decide to build from plans, your first step is to cut out all of the parts you'll need. Since the Passagemaker is 12 foot long, you'll have to scarf full and half sheets of plywood together. The scarf joint is an 8-to-1 taper that gives a lot of contact area for the epoxy to bond the sheets together. It requires a sharp hand plane to cut the scarves along the plywood layers. I then sweeten the edges up with the sander. I applied non-thickened epoxy to the bare plywood, then added thickened epoxy to fill the joint. Here I am aligning the joint and applying clamping pressure to cure overnight. The plans are full size, so you can lay the sheets right on top of the plywood and start laying out your parts. This is the bottom panel. Brad nails and a batten help to connect the dots. Cleaning up your parts before assembly makes the sanding go much easier. Here I am laying out and tracing the stern transom and the stiffener. After laying out the parts, I rough cut them to break down the full sheet of plywood to make it more manageable. I can then go back and cut out the parts more accurately. Note that I'm not only cutting out the marine grade plywood parts, but I'm also making masonite templates at the same time. Here are two different cuts, one with the jigsaw and another with a Japanese pull saw. Several of the parts get their edges rounded over with a router bit for comfort. This is much easier before assembly. Now I'm cutting a hole for the optional deck plates. This is to allow the buoyancy tanks to breathe and a small bit of dry storage. Planks that form the sides must have a rabbet routed on the bottom edge. Part 2, prepping your kit. Slow set epoxy is mixed with a 2-to-1 ratio, then stirred for a few minutes. Then you have several minutes to use it before it starts to harden. One of the first assembly steps is to attach the stiffeners to the transoms with thickened epoxy. Note I am only applying the epoxy where the two parts overlap. Once the bow and stern transoms have cured overnight, I can cut the handles into them. This makes it much easier to move the finished 90-pound boat around. Once the handles are cut out and filed smooth, I can round over all the edges of the transoms. They are now ready for assembly. Now seal the planks with a coat of epoxy. Let cure, sand, then add another coat of epoxy, sand again. The planks are now ready for assembly. Part 3, making a boat-shaped thing. CLC uses a process called stitch and glue to form the hull. First you drill holes about 4 inches apart, then you stitch the panels together using wire. This allows the boat to be built without a mold. Once the boat is completely stitched together, you can start to lock the parts in place with thickened epoxy fillets. One trick is to only epoxy between the stitches, then once that cures, you can remove the stitches and fillet the entire joint. With the entire boat stitched together, flip the hull and epoxy where the planks overlap. This will make the hull very rigid. I started with epoxy and cartridges, but it was too cold, so I switched to hand-mixed epoxy. Once the epoxy has cured, you can remove the stitches and make a nice smooth fillet down each seam. It's time to fiberglass the entire bottom. Mask off the bottom plank and lay out your cloth. Flood the cloth with unthickened epoxy, then use a squeegee to spread it around. I opted to fiberglass the garboard planks too. Now that the hull is rigid, you can trim the planks at the transoms. Be careful you don't damage the transoms in case you want to leave them with a bright finish. Here I am making a larger continuous fillet that covers the tack weld fillet I did earlier. This is the large fillet that smooths the transition between the bottom panel and the garboard. This will allow the fiberglass cloth to lay flat. As we did with the interior is glassed by laying out the cloth, flooding it with unthickened epoxy, and spreading it around with a squeegee. Now I fill the weave of the fiberglass cloth with 2 coats of unthickened epoxy. Next I install one of the bulkheads. It's tacked in place, the stitches are removed, then a larger fillet finishes the joint. Here I'm routing the slot in the center seat for the dagger board. The daggerboard case interior is fiberglassed, then coated with graphite epoxy for abrasion resistance. Once the daggerboard case is assembled and installed, I can drill holes in the bottom of the hull. With the holes as a guide, I can route out the daggerboard slot. After finding the center line, I can bed the skeg square to the bottom. Then a large fillet will hold it in place. Instead of solid wood skids, I opted for plywood laminated ones where I used the hull as the bending form. Once they cured, I rounded over the edges with a router. I decided to use penetrating epoxy to make the skids more rugged and waterproof. Then I fiberglassed over them. Now it was time to start milling the mahogany for the gunnels. First I ripped them to height and width, and then I milled a rabbet to cover the edge of the plywood. Then I had to cut a scarf joint since my mahogany strips weren't 12 foot long. Using thickened epoxy and all the clamps I own, I clamped the gunnel in place. The gunnel is made from 2 layers of laminated mahogany, so this step took a couple of days. After the gunnels had cured, I was able to sand them flush and round the edges over with a router. I went with graphite epoxy instead of bottom paint for abrasion resistance. I used a couple coats of high build primer followed by sanding to fair the hull. I followed that up with a couple coats of 2-part paint, sanding between coats. Here I'm prepping for the rudder hardware. Once I don't need access anymore to the inside of the stern transom, I can bed the aft thwart. Bedding the other thwarts is done the same way. Part 4, Blades and Spars. The interior of the rudder head gets the same graphite epoxy treatment. Here I'm laying out the bevels on the dagger board so that it glides through the water. Using a Shinto rasp, I carefully file the plywood away, exposing the layers beneath to ensure a smooth bevel. Here I'm cutting out and shaping the gooseneck in preparation for attaching it to the boom. In order to make sure the spars are straight, I have to start with a straight edge. That's where having a jointer comes in really handy. Then I plane the stock to the specified thickness. Before I laminate the mast halves together, I route out a slot for the masthead sheave. The optional wooden mast is hollow with a groove up the center. After laminating the mast halves, I clean up the edges. Then I round over the corners. Cut the mast to length and shape the base. Next up is drilling the hole for the masthead sheave and to do a test fit. Here I am installing the removable mast base. The mahogany tiller gets rounded over with the router. Then the slot for the rudder head gets cut out. Part 5. Rigging the boat. I lay the mast in place so the base is near the step. Then I connect the two shrouds on both ends and the forestay at the top. Then I pivot the mast up until I can connect the forestay to the bow knee. The boom gets attached at the gooseneck and I bend on the sails. Don't forget the battens. Connect the jib sheets and the main sheet and you're ready. Part 6. Go sailing.
Bye, Daddy. Bye, Daddy.
Thanks for watching. For more epic builds, check out midnightmaker.com.